Welcome. The offense of Lent. Lent confronts us with what St. Paul speaks of as an offense of the gospel, as well as its folly in 1 Corinthians 1:18. This foolishness and offense of the gospel has largely been lost. Intuitively, we know that there is something different about Lent and Good Friday. Interestingly, we have not truly reflected upon the reasons for our discomfort, but it is clear that there is something about the season of the church year that makes us rather uneasy. We want to leap over Lent and Good Friday to Easter Sunday. Everyone likes a celebration. The celebration of Easter with its bunnies and chocolates provides an excuse to avoid the offense of Lent. The reason I believe for our discomfort with Lent and Good Friday concerns our knowledge and understanding of God. This understanding has been shaped by natural theologies from the past. The traditional view of God was that God was an all-powerful deity, a God who is from the beginning, before the world was made, and above and apart from creation. All this God has to do is to speak, and what is spoken comes into being. God is understood to be the first cause of all creation, a God who creates out of nothing, ex nihilo. God was the answer to all questions about creation. With God in charge, it is believed that the world has a purpose and is moving under God's guidance to fulfilling God's purpose. God is pictured as an all-powerful, a transcendent and awesome God. This is the God of creationists and those putting forth the idea of intelligent design. For them, God has to be all-powerful in order to support their belief. This God has been co-opted by those in power to justify their actions. By claiming this God to be on their side, allow those in power to maintain the loyalty of their followers. This is the God of civil religion. Civil religion rallies the people with slogans such as "God with us," and cynically puts on their coins "In God we trust." This God of civil religion invokes as a buttress that undergirds the claims and actions of those in power in the oppression of those who oppose them. To question such leaders is then to question God. In the past, this was the God who was believed to support the divine right of kings to rule. This understanding has been surfaced in the claims of leaderships in dictators, democracies, and even in religion extremists. Something changed 150 years ago, to be precise, in 1859, when the publication of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of the Species. What has changed is what Daniel C. Dennett describes as Darwin's very dangerous idea. Since that moment, Christians have been caught in a dilemma. This dilemma, a significant section of a conservative churches vigorously deny and oppose. Meanwhile, the majority of the mainline churches largely pay lip service and ignore the dilemma of Darwin's dangerous idea. What changed as a result of Darwin's dangerous idea? What changed was tectonic shift in the understanding of God and creation. The traditional way of understanding that relationship, which was rooted in natural theology, has lost its validity. God was no longer needed to understand the universe, not only its beginning, but its ongoing evolution. What was so dangerous about Darwin's theory of evolution? At the heart of Darwin's theory is the process he referred to as natural selection. Natural selection brings about changes through a process referred to as survival of the fittest. Unfortunately, this is often misunderstood as being about physical strength. In this popular understanding, it meant that those who survive are those who have the ability and the strength to survive. However, this popular notion is wrong and not what Darwin meant. For him, the survival of the fittest referred to those who survived through successful reproduction. Nature now had its own process for shaping its future. God was no longer needed as an explanation. Nature takes care of itself by having its future determined by those in a species who can successfully reproduce themselves. This meant that nature had its own creation process and that God was now redundant. With the all-powerful God now redundant, is there a place for theology? Biologist Richard Dawkins and others believe that there is no longer any place for any religion. Darwin's dangerous idea has invalidated all claims made about God in religions. God has been dethroned. This was the basis of the debate sponsored by the British Broadcasting Corporation and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation between Richard Dawkins and Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister of England. Unfortunately, Blair was no match for Dawkins and his claims concerning the redundancy of religion. The world no longer needed an all-powerful God who creates. Nature is quite capable of taking care of itself. This opposition of Dawkins and others like psychologist Steven Pinker and the sociobiologist E.O. Wilson have been vigorously opposed by creationists and those who promote intelligent design. Their defense is of God who is all-powerful creator and who created all things. Unfortunately, this defense of God is a failure. They fail to appreciate there is no longer a place for an all-powerful God as an explanation for creation. While the scientific materialists like Dawkins are actively promoting the dethroning of such an all-powerful God, the creationists are actively trying to enthrone this all-powerful God again. More problematic is that the creationists are caught in a bind, which is also a problem for scientific materialists. In all their efforts to enthrone God again, they are focusing on the distant past. They fail to appreciate that creation is not a once-off event, but is an ongoing process. The clash of these two realities has major implications. In his book on consilience, E.O. Wilson describes how he had a conversion in Southern Baptist Church when he was 16. He read the Bible, he said, 3 times. It was when he went to university he discovered that there was another reality and explanation, other than that which one was provided by the Southern Baptist Church. That teaching from the Southern Baptist Church was very critical of Darwin's theory. The other reality provided a far more adequate and better explanation about nature than that provided by his church. This new reality to which he exposed did not require belief in creationism and submission to the church's authority in defining what is really real. This discovery led him to become an atheist. The fear of sending a child to university is often framed by parents as a place where they will lose their faith. This comment implies that it is the universities who are at fault. From Wilson's experience, the problem was not with the university, but with his church and the clergy who promoted an understanding of reality that could not and still cannot stand examination. But this is not just a problem for those from these fundamentalistic churches. The mainline churches are also part of the problem, since very few clergy have struggled with these two competing realities, and as a result, the students from their parishes are also ill-equipped to deal with questions about religion, science, and God. What has all this to do with Lent and Good Friday? I believe that it is precisely in the messages of Lent and Good Friday that Christians can address the claims put forward by scientific materialists. Lent refutes the belief that God must be understood as an all-powerful God, the one who stands above and outside of creation, the one who creates. The God of Lent is the one who instead comes to us in humility and weakness and enters into creation. Being weak does not mean that God is powerless, but God's power is paradoxically revealed in God's divine love. It is precisely here that we find the offense of the gospel and what many would see as foolishness. This is the antithesis of the position not only of the creationists and scientific materialists who argue that God is the God of power. The God of the Bible is one who comes in weakness, the one who comes in humility. A God who, according to St. Paul, empties God's self. In the ongoing debate, neither side can acknowledge a God who is humble and who comes in weakness. This is the God who is rejected, abused, and crucified, and is an offense and a foolishness to all. Scripture, on the other hand, witnesses to God who is vulnerable and offers God's self for the salvation of the cosmos. This contrasting picture of God is clearly seen in the meeting of Elijah and God at Horeb. He would think that God would come as a powerful God, shaking the mountains, splitting the mountains, breaking the rocks in pieces. But God comes in the still small voice. God comes to Elijah not as an all-powerful and almighty one, but in a still small voice. God comes not with chariots and fire, but as a vulnerable infant in a manger. Perhaps the greatest irony is reflected in the nativity plays in churches. All the roles are played by children. Even Jesus is portrayed as a child, weak and vulnerable. The irony is that the congregations choose those who are weak, small, and insignificant to witness to the gospel of God, without realizing that their theological understanding of God is probably the exact opposite. The idea that God is humble and weak is utterly foolish and offensive to many. The God of the nativity plays is not the God over whom creationists and scientific materialists are arguing. This is the God of the gospel revealed in Jesus the Christ, born in a manger. We find God walking with the broken, the wounded, God touching the untouchable leper, a God mocked, abused, beaten, crucified, dead and buried in a borrowed grave. This is the God of Lent and Good Friday. This is the God who participates in creation, allows creation to become co-creators. This is why the church needs to rediscover Lent and Good Friday in order to be reawakened to the offense and the foolishness of the gospel. Furthermore, this is the church's response to those who believe that there's only one reality, whether that of creationists or of scientific materialists. There is another reality, the reality of God who enters creation in humility and whose power is revealed in divine love. This is the God of whom Scripture witnesses. One of the implications of Darwin's nature's idea is that nature is cruel, chaotic, destructive, and filled with death. Natural selection means not only that some, namely those who are successful in reproduction, have a hope for the future. Nature is not a Walt Disney show, but a violent and filled with killing and death. Nature is chaotic, since the process of natural selection leaves many wounded by the wayside. And as some scientific materialists have argued, there is no right or wrong in nature, no good or bad, no ethics. Natural selection is a process that just is. Consequently, Darwinian theory cannot deal with the presence of pain and suffering. If some of the followers of Darwin cannot deal with the question of pain and suffering, neither can the creationists. If God is all-powerful and all-almighty and has created everything and is in charge, why does God then not deal with suffering and pain and death? Once again, we turn to the witness of Scripture. The God of Scripture is the one who comes in humility and participates in the pain, in the suffering in the world, even sharing in our death. It is not surprising then that this witness to God is perceived as an offense. Even in the church, we would much prefer to skip over Lent and Good Friday and head straight to Easter to avoid the offense of God, who in love dies for the whole cosmos. This is not the God we desire. We seek a God like Zeus, ruling with power over a pantheon of other gods, or a God like Thor, who has a voice of thunder and shakes the world and makes it tremble. This is the God we often pray to. Darwin brings us face to face with another dilemma. He struggled with the conundrum of altruism. How could natural selection choose altruism? Altruism implies that there are some who are willing to offer themselves for others without successful reproduction of their genes. Darwin believed that the question of altruism could undermine his whole theory. How is it possible for natural selection to select for a gene for altruism? Darwin was not aware of the science of genetics. William Hamilton proposed a very simple formula to explain altruism, which takes into account how the benefits outweigh the costs. This led to the concept of kin selection. His proposition is still held by many today. However, his most avid disciple, E.O. Wilson, most recently rejected the work of Hamilton, and so the debate of altruism is reopened. For Christians, the message of Lent is one of an altruistic God, a God who sacrifices himself for the cosmos. This witness of Scripture faces everyone with a conundrum, the conundrum which presents two contradictory images of God. There's a God of power on the one side who is outside of creation, and on the other side, a God who empties God's self and enters into creation. A God who gives up all pretense of power to walk with the powerless, with the weak, with the suffering, and with the poor. A God who is not removed from the world and is untouchable, but one who enters the world and touches the lepers. This message of God is an offense and foolishness. Just as Darwin struggled with the problem of altruism, so too does the church. What does one do with an altruistic God? How is one to believe in a God who gives God's self and there's nothing in it for God? The message of Lent and Good Friday is as much of an offense today as it was 2,000 years ago. It will always remain an offense, since the witness to God offends humankind to the core. The God of Lent and the God of Good Friday is not the God we want to desire. Humankind honors strength, not weakness. The God of civil religion has to be strong, Otherwise, such a God is irrelevant. A God of humility whose power is love is only appropriated when the God of power is abandoned. My thanks go to the theologian John Hart for stimulating my thinking around this topic, especially in his book,